give an introduction, and then I'll introduce our speaker, and we can take it from there.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here at this Global Perspectives event. My name is Elena. I work for the OSA as a peer advisor. And before we welcome Professor Laura Kelley and our guest speaker, Naoise O'Duinn, I just wanted to give kind of a brief explanation of what this Global Perspective series is and how you might be able to get involved. So this series is hosted by the Tulane Center for Global Education, and it includes all kinds of virtual programming that surrounds cultural engagement. We've had past events on hip hop as a social motivator in Senegal. We've done history of bats in European cities. We're doing this now, obviously, all kinds of things really. We aim to address relevant and interdisciplinary topics through diverse global perspectives, and we collaborate with Tulane's global partners in doing so. If you have any proposals for programming that you might like to see, we are welcoming applications at the time. So you could do that through the CGE website. And this event will be recorded as well to be posted on the Office of Study Abroad's YouTube channel. So you'll have access to it afterwards. And without further ado, I'm handing over the floor.
Okay, great. Ooh, I don't know what happened there. Okay, so hi, everybody. Just very briefly, I wanted to introduce Naoise. I met Naoise in the summer of 2019 when we took our students from the Tulane summer this summer in Dublin program. And we were at the National Leprechaun Museum, which has always been a big favorite with the students, and it's sort of storytelling at its best, and Naoise was fantastic. And so I got his name and number right then and there, and I said, you must come speak to our students in 2020. And we all know how 2020 went, and then how 2021 went. But fortunately, Naoise was able to speak to students last year through this same program with Global Perspectives. And this last summer, we were able to actually go live in person and do the tour at the museum, as well as have him come speak to the students. So very, very happy to welcome you back and to welcome you to this new group of students, and let you take over and start telling them a bit about Samhain and Irish myth and folklore and all the good stories that I know you have bouncing around in your head. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So thanks a mil for having me back. I can only assume that I didn't embarrass myself terribly the last 2 times I was talking with you. So as Laura said there, I've been working with the National Leprechaun Museum in Ireland for roughly 6 years now, which makes me feel incredibly old. But just for a very brief moment of what I do and who I am. I was originally trained as an actor, but when I got a job at the Leprechaun Museum, I fell in love with Irish folklore and mythology. Like a lot of us, I was raised with traditional storytelling. My mum would read me stories going to sleep, and she was a bit of a storyteller herself. But I was always kind of slightly aware of Irish mythology, but more so I was aware of the big ones, Greek mythology, Brothers Grimm. And I was vaguely aware that fairies were a thing in Irish folklore, and the ever ubiquitous leprechauns were bloody everywhere. But after working in the museum, I just fell in love with it. And I think it's just a really fascinating, interesting area to delve into and research. And even beyond that, there's a reason these stories have been told and retold and retold down through the generations. We've entered storytelling season today because Halloween does owe a huge amount to the traditional Irish festival of Samhain. I hesitate to say Celtic because the word Celt is wrapped up in so much misinformation, and I debate whether or not it's a useful term, but we'll say Celtic for now. It was probably a harvest festival. It was the time when you'd gathered in all of the food from the fields. The animals had been returned from their summer pastures to their winter homes. So in many ways, the year was ending or beginning. Some say that Samhain marked the start of the Irish New Year. Part of that is because the Irish people, up until relatively recent times, were heavily pastoral. We still practice transhumance until relatively recent times. And again, dealing with history, that's a couple of centuries we're dealing with. But since we were tied to the natural rhythms of the animals we kept, rather than dealing with a solar calendar like a lot of other cultures, Ireland's always dealt with lunar calendar, and the 4 cross-border festivals take place Samhain, 1st of November, Imbolc, 1st of February, and then Bealtaine, the counterpart to Samhain that takes place in the summertime, taking place on the 1st day of May, and then the proper harvest festival, Lunasa, which would have taken place at the end of August, beginning of September. Samhain is definitely known to be the most important of the 4 cross-border festivals. It looms large, both in folk traditions, in stories. So many events in Irish mythology take place at the time of Samhain. It still has a huge amount of tradition associated with it. And it is the starting place for looking at how modern Halloween develops. Halloween is a global festival now, but it was very much so an American festival, influenced heavily by the traditions of Samhain. The reason we go around dressing up in costumes, trick-or-treating door to door, is because in the Irish folk tradition, there were 2 worlds, our own world and the other world, also known as the She, home to souls of the dead, strange creatures, which for some reason have been labeled with the English name fairies, pukas, shape-shifting spirits, and of course, the souls of the dead. They all returned to you on Samhain night. And because it was a very dangerous time to be out and about, you spent your day locked indoors. You'd go, if you wanted to go outdoors, you needed to make sure you took adequate precautions to blend in with these supernatural creatures by dressing up in costumes, a habit that we called guising, which now is the modern habit of just dressing up in a costume and trick-or-treating door to door. Originally, tricks were actually very separate to the habit of going from house to house to house. You went along asking for supplies and food and treats to help with the Halloween party. But in terms of tricks, that would take place much later at night. Since it was assumed that fairies and other creatures were wandering around on Halloween evening, you could blame any tricks or any mischief that took place that night on fairies, on strange creatures, rather than taking the flak yourself. So to blend in with supernatural creatures, you dressed up, and also to disguise yourself from the neighbors you were playing tricks on, you dressed up. Tricking and mischief was a huge part of the Samhain traditions. So much so that in certain parts of Ireland today, it's actually known by the name the Night of Tricks, as opposed to Halloween, which obviously comes from All Hallows Eve. Now, I'm aware I'm just word vomiting at the moment. There is some vague structure in my head. As Laura knows, I do like to ramble, but I actually put myself some PowerPoint stuff to try and make sure that I stay on topic this time. So, Samhain is a time of year when the veil between our world and the other world grows thin. Souls of the dead returned from their graves, and it was a time to remember them. That's why it was eventually merged with the Christian festival of All Hallows Eve, followed by All Souls Day, because that was a time to celebrate and remember the saints, or hallows, and the day after to remember all the souls of your dead and your ancestors. It didn't originally take place on the 31st of October. That was a much later development in the 9th century. Up till then, it had actually taken place earlier in the year during the summertime. Most people believe that it was moved by the Pope in order to co-opt the pagan festival, and not just Samhain here. Obviously, a lot of places in Europe would have had their own harvest festivals, their own end-of-year festivals, their own winter festivals. But in Ireland, they tried to replace it. Didn't work very well, because as with most attempts to overly Christianize the Irish people, we became devoutly Christian while also maintaining a huge amount of the pagan traditions and beliefs that underlying everything else that we did as a Catholic nation. So it became a night to remember the dead. It was expected that the souls of your dead ancestors would return on Samhain night, come into your house, and they expected to find dinner waiting for them. It was tradition to leave out an additional plate of food when you were putting out your own meal, and then you'd retreat upstairs after finishing your dinner and leave that plate of food for the dead to enjoy during the dumb supper. Dumb because it was entirely silent. You'd also leave offerings of food and possibly milk for the fairies on that night to try and keep them sweet for the upcoming year. The whole of Samhain was very focused on remembering the past and remembering our ancestors, but also looking forward to what the future had in store. So During the night, you'd also be playing a lot of games, a lot of divination to see what future would have in store for you, what events might be shaping your life in the upcoming year. And so you played various games, and you'd also put it into your food. To this day in Ireland, when it comes around to Halloween, we serve barn brack, which is Irish for speckled cake. It's filled with fruit, nuts, various other nice things, but you traditionally put a ring inside, and whoever gets the slice with the ring in it is fated to be married that year. A lot of the games back then were focused around who you were going to marry, whether or not you were going to marry, because for women, unfortunately, the whole purpose of your early life was to get to marriageable age, find a nice partner and settle down. And men weren't even considered to be real men until they had married in the Irish tradition. Even you could be 30, maybe 40, 50, you were still considered a boy unless you'd been settled down. You're still a bachelor, no hope for you, no standing in the community. So you wanted very much so to see what your husband or spouse might be like. And you could, if you got the ring in the brack, you knew you were getting married that year. To find out what your husband might look like, you go to the field and pick cabbages. Whichever cabbage you pulled out, you'd find some way to learn something about your future husband. If there was a lot of earth clinging to it, it was assumed that they'd be wealthy and you'd never have want for any physical needs. If it was thin and sickly, they might assume that your partner would be sickly and they'd die before you in the marriage. You could also take an apple, carve off the skin, trying to not break it, and then you throw it behind you, and it was supposed to form the initials of the name of your future spouse. Now that's the more savory divinatory games. Naturally, divination wasn't pretty much frowned upon by the Christian community, and those lesser games were tolerated, whereas other ones were definitely condemned. There's a huge section of belief about the devil on Halloween night, where if you do various things in the name of the devil, you can gain certain boons. Musicians were said to be on the lookout for a bramble that was rooted twice into the earth, forming an archway. Because if you then crawled under that archway and made a promise in the name of the devil, you would gain incredible musical power. Apparently, there was a piper who did that one Halloween and was gifted a magical fiddle with only one string. But whenever he played upon that single string, he would play the most beautiful, enchanting music. Anyone who heard it said that that music was supernatural, did not come from our world, and did not belong here. But he kept playing it anyway. Eventually, driven from Ireland, he had to move to France, where he got taken into the court of the French king. He performed with him till the day he died, and as he lay dying in his bed, the fiddle was hanging on the wall behind him. And the moment he drew his last breath, they heard a snap as the string broke, and the fiddle fell from the ceiling, smashing into the floor into smithereens. Another piper tried to do similar on that night. He went in search of a bramble bush to crawl under to gain musical talent, because his name was Diggin the Piper. Now, from that name, you probably correctly guess he could play the pipes, in which case we're talking about the uilleann pipes, very similar to the Scottish bagpipes, but rather than blowing into them and making a sound like cats being murdered, you squeeze them in your arms in a bellows action and make a sound like cats being smothered by a pillow. It's a beautiful sound as long as you know what you're doing. And Diggin was good, very good even, not great. He'd always dreamed of being so much better because he saw his friends and his companions completely outpacing him in life. So one Halloween night, he went off in search of a bramble bush to gain the power of music from the devil himself. Instead, as he was passing by the local fairy hill, he heard the most beautiful music he'd ever heard in his life. The music of the Sidhe is said to be so stunningly beautiful that if you hear it, it can cause all other music to lose its power. Everything else in your life becomes grey and dull in comparison to that beautiful tune. And Diggin didn't even realize what was happening. He was there listening to the music of the Sidhe, and his hands just went down to his pipes and he began to play along. He didn't even think he was playing the song. It was as if the song was playing him. His hands moved faster than he'd ever moved them before, until he suddenly realized only he was playing. The rest, the other music, stopped, and he then felt strange eyes looking at him. He looked back up to the top of the fairy hill, and he could see a tall, pale man, piercing blue eyes and long golden hair, staring at him. "Diggin," he said, "that music is not for you." And Dickon didn't expect himself to argue with one of the She, but he knew he needed that music in his life. "No," he said, "please, it's so beautiful. Can I not play it again?" He wasn't sure if the creature sneered or smiled, but Ben nodded. "Very well, Diggin. You played it well enough for mortal hands. We'll allow you to play that music 3 more times, only 3. And once you're done forever. For if you play that music a 4th time, you'll try our patience." And as he spoke the last words, Diggin fell down, and all he knew was blackness. When he woke up the next morning, he was lying in a tumbled heap at the bottom of the fairy hill. He was beginning to think the whole thing had been a dream, when suddenly the fairy tune came to his mind. Wanting to make sure he remembered it correctly, he took out the pipes. True enough, that music flowed through him again. It filled his heart with joy when he played it, but then he realized one of his 3 playings of the tune were already finished. He decided he'd have to ration it from that day on. He still went around from bar to bar performing his music, but it didn't hold the same luster. All of his other tunes seemed so drab and dull compared to the music of the She. Until one day he decided he'd bust out the music. He had a really big gig coming up. It was going to be a huge crowd of people. If he did well that day, he'd never have to play a gig again for another year. So he went to the bar, took out the pipes, and as he stared out at the crowd, he cocked a smile, put his arms to the pipes, and all the most beautiful tune flowed from them. People, young and old, as soon as they heard that music, leapt to their feet. They began dancing like creatures possessed. They danced and danced as the music flowed and flowed, until finally the tune was done. Everyone leapt to their feet, clapping and cheering. And in fact, Diggin made more money that night than he'd made in his entire life before. And several years passed. Now that he was comfortable with his cash, he played his music less and less. The joy just wasn't there anymore. In fact, he was half retired, but he was a legend. News of that song he knew traveled far and wide. Everyone wanted him to play the song, but he never would. He was rationing it. He'd only had 1 more time left. Until finally, proper occasion came along. His own sister was getting married to a handsome man, and he decided that he would play at their reception, and as her wedding gift, he'd play the fairy music for the final time for her. At this stage, it had been 2 years since he'd last played it. He was beginning to worry as he walked up in front of the crowd and sat down on the stool if he even knew how to play it anymore. But he needn't worry. That music was in his very bones. As soon as he put hands to pipe, the music of the She flowed once again, even wilder than last time. The crowd, once again possessed, leapt to their feet, dancing, clapping, cheering, leaping through the air. And when he was finished playing, everyone agreed it was the finest performance any of them had ever heard and would ever hear in their entire lives. And I'd love to say that's where the story ends. Diggin went along to a fairy hill on Halloween night, got some music from the She, played it 3 times, and lived happily ever after. But that's not how the story goes. For after playing the music at his sister's wedding, news of him traveled far and wide again. Apparently, there was to be a piping contest in his hometown in his honor. They'd heard how fantastic Diggin was, and so they wanted to celebrate him by inviting pipers the island over to the house. They came along to play, and he was, of course, the guest of honor. But when they came to the competition, well, many of the pipers there were middling at best. Some were very talented, and Diggin knew what he was doing. He outpaced most of them, even without the music of the she, but there was one man. He had this look in his eye like he'd been far and wide throughout the world, and he was an expert at the pipes. Rumour had it that he'd played in the courts of the kings of Europe, and had only come here because he'd heard of how good Diggin was. And the way he looked at Diggin when he was fumbling away on the uilleann pipes, he wasn't impressed. But the crowd muttered to themselves. They knew as soon as Diggin busted out his signature tune, he was bound to win the contest. And Diggin knew that was the only way he could. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was because he didn't want to let the crowd of friends, family, neighbours, people he'd known his whole life down. But when it got to the final contest, just him and the man, he decided to play the fairy tune one last time. Flowed through him, wilder than ever before. His blood felt like it was boiling with fire as he played and played on the pipes. The crowd were lost in a frenzy. When the playing finally stopped, they collected themselves. Women had been ripping off their bodices and dancing in their bare feet. Men had been leaping like stags off the mountain. But now that the music stopped, they all came back to themselves and looked around. Everyone agreed Diggin had won, and they went to congratulate him. And there he was, still sitting on the stool. But he wasn't moving. His eyes were open, but they were glazed over. His hands were still on the pipes. And on his face was the biggest smile any of them had ever seen. But unfortunately, having played the music for the fourth time, cost Diggin his life. Because the fairies do jealously guard their secrets. And when I'm talking about fairies, I hope you got it from the physical description earlier, but they're nothing like the more modern image many of us have of Victorian flower fairies or Tinkerbell. Originally, they were the Tua de Danann, who may have been the pre-Christian gods of Ireland, but unfortunately, all the information that we know about the Tua de comes to us from Christian monks, who are a hostile audience at best. Most of the time, they euphemize them, either to be just a regular race of men who learned the ways of magic, powerful ancestors, or sometimes demons, sometimes angels, more often than not, something kind of in between the two. The fairies were dangerous. They were the good neighbours who lived deep inside of our hollow hills, portals to the other world of the she. We could only get there by being invited inside one of their hills, or on Halloween night when all of the hills were open. As I said earlier, one of the most important things about Samhain was that it was a time when the veil between our world and the other world grew thin. As it may have been the new year, and was definitely a transition to the darker half of the year, Samhain night was a time betwixt and between. It was a night that was liminal because it didn't belong to the old year or to the new year. It wasn't part of the dark half of the year or the light half of the year. As things were changing over, the earth was spiritually charged. Fairies were often encountered, and you could easily get into their fairy hills on that night. They were said to be feasting and dancing, just as we were, because it was tradition to gather up all the fruit and nuts you'd gathered from the harvest, get all the grains together, and have the biggest feast of the year, stocking yourselves up for a long, harsh winter to come. In fact, one Samhain, one of Ireland's greatest heroes, Finn McCool, who was the leader of the Fianna of Ireland. Now, the Fianna, think Robin Hood's Merry Men meets the Night's Watch from Game of Thrones. They lived rough in the wilderness. They would fight against Ireland's invaders, to drive monsters from our shores. but they'd severed their family ties. The Fianna were an actual social institution that used to be practiced in Ireland between the ages of 14 and 21, when you were no longer a boy or a child, but you weren't quite yet a fully grown man. You had no responsibilities, no property. So you joined the Fianna. They then take care of you, teaching you the ways of war, how to hunt, how to fight, how to live off the land, and of course, the ancient art of poetry. And in exchange, you'd fight for them and sell your swords to the highest bidder. The thing is, though, you have to leave your family behind. Back in the day in Ireland, most of our laws were guided by blood price. Basically, if you did something to someone and wronged them in any way, you owed them compensation. In fact, every single person from the High King of Ireland down to the lowest serf had some form of honor price that you had to pay if you wronged them. Obviously, a highly imbalanced system where the life of a king was worth about 50 times the life of any woman. But if you, say, wronged someone, it was within their rights to take revenge on you or your wider family. Since the Fianna would be killing a lot of people, incurring a lot of wrath from a lot of different people, to keep your own family safe, you officially severed your family ties, and the Fianna became your family. If you died, they would avenge you. If anyone wanted to avenge any of your wrongdoings, they'd fight in your corner. They were a band of brothers, occasionally women, led by Ireland's greatest hero, Finn McCool. He was said to possess a magical thumb of wisdom. Apparently, one Halloween night when he was only a teenage boy, he'd overheard two fairies arguing about trying to woo a beautiful fairy woman. Overhearing their conversation, he'd crept closer and closer to the fairy hill. But when they'd seen him, they tried to run inside and close the door behind him. Finn tried to stop them, but as he did, he got his thumb caught in the doorway. And being touched by a portal to the other world of the She did something strange. So that from that day on, whenever Finn had to call upon the wisdom of the world to answer any question he might ask, all he had to do was bite on his thumb. Most modern sources say suck on his thumb. It's a much nicer version because you would bite the thumb, piercing through the flesh, then through the muscle, right down to the bone, and then through the bone into the marrow. And once he tasted his own marrow, he knew anything that he needed to know. With this power, he'd taken over the Fianna. And one year, around Samhain, the Fianna were camped out in the north of Ireland, in the middle of a forest. They were setting up camp for a big Samhain feast, and Finn went out to scout the perimeter. As I mentioned, the Fianna had many enemies, and they might well try and attack him on Samhain night. He was there with his two hunting dogs, Bran and Sceolan, who are technically his cousins, but that's a different story. When he saw three strangers approaching, two men and a woman. One dressed entirely in brown, one dressed entirely in black, and the woman dressed from head to toe in deep, dark grey. They came up to Finn and introduced themselves. Namely, they were Dawn, Dove, and Leah, or in Irish, brown, black, and grey. We are very literal when it comes to naming things in Irish. They said that they'd heard that Finn McCool was the greatest boss in Ireland. They really wanted to join the Fianna and were willing to do anything to earn some sort of intern position. Now, Finn was on the lookout for a handy intern because he wanted to go back and join the party, but he knew somebody was going to have to stay out at the perimeter the whole night, making sure that no one attacked them. Unless these three suckers could do it. He said to Brown, Black, and Grey that he would happily let them join the Fianna for a year, see how they got on, and to prove themselves was very easy. All they'd have to do, stay in this spot and make sure that the camp where the Fianna were having their party was safe. And the three readily agreed. They went to talk with the three amongst them, deciding which one would watch first, which one second, and which one last. Some of them began building a fire. When Finn bent down and started talking to Bran. Now, if you asked Finn, he'd say he did not prefer either Bran or Sceolan. He loved them both equally as if they were his own children. But as with most parents, he obviously had a favorite. Bran. She was the apple of his eye. He trusted her more than any other creature on the earth. So he went down to Bran and told her she'd better stay as well. It's not that he didn't trust these three strangers, it's just he wasn't one to leave himself defenseless. He told Bran to stay there to help them watch, even though she was more likely going to keep an eye on them than anything that might be approaching. And with the matter sorted, he and Sgeolan returned to the festivities, and it was decided that Bran would give the first watch. The other two fell asleep next to the fort fire, and Bran began to wander away from the camp, keeping their eyes peeled for any dangers. When in the distance they saw some strange lights. "What do you think?" said Bran. "Should we follow them?" And Bran nodded. So Bran and Bran followed those lights until they came to a hill. And the lights were coming from just at the bottom. Now, Bran and Bran had passed by that hill before. But this night they could see a doorway. And streaming out of the doorway was a strange, otherworldly light. And now that they were closer, they could hear the sounds of a feast. So Bran and Bran went up to the doorway in the hill and peering in, they saw a large crowd of people, all of them singing, dancing, eating, and drinking. Now, some of them were regular men. Some of them were tiny men. Some of them had heads of cats. Some of them heads of dogs. Some of them heads of goats. Some of them no heads. Some of them two heads. Some of them heads in their stomachs. And he realized then that they'd stumbled upon an entrance to the She. And just at that moment, they noticed Bran and Bran. If they'd been expecting a fight, they needn't have. They all cheered and told them to come inside and join the feast, and asked if they'd like a drink. Well, they both wanted a drink, to be honest. Unfortunately, there didn't seem to be many cups available. In fact, as Bran looked, there only seemed to be one goblet being passed around the whole room. And he could see no bottles refilling it, but it went from person to person. They'd all take deep, long draughts. Long enough that Bran thought the goblet should have been empty many, many passes ago, but yet it still kept going around. Till eventually it reached him and Bran. He could see the cup was still filled up to the brim, so he took the goblet in hand, took a long, healthy drink, and it was the most delicious mead he'd ever tasted in his life. And before his very eyes, even though he drained the goblet to half empty, it began to refill before him. He looked down at Bran. Bran looked up at him. "What do you think?" said Bran. Bran nodded. So he took the goblet under one arm and legged it out the door. Before they'd even realized what was happening, he was back at his camp, kicking Black awake because it was his turn for the watch. So Dove went off with Bran, looking around the edge of the camp, till eventually they noticed some strange lights. Following the lights, once again they came to the fairy hill. And when Dove and Bran peered inside, they saw the same crowd of people, but the mood had changed. Everyone was arguing, accusing the other of having stolen the goblet, or broken the goblet, or done something terrible. And it looked like a fight was about to break out, when suddenly a big, tall man with 4 arms and 3 heads roared, calm down. The night is not lost. Even without our drink, we can still have a party." He then took up a huge haunch of meat, ripped off a chunk with his teeth, and passed it to the next man. And before Dove's eyes, the meat came back, so that the haunch was whole once again. It went around the whole room, everyone eating their fill, and yet it got no smaller. Until it reached Dove. He looked down at Bran. Bran looked up at him. "What do you think?" he said. Bran nodded. So he took the meat under his arm and legged it out the door. Before the She had even realized what was happening, he was back at the camp, kicking Leah awake because it was her turn for the last watch. Now, when she set off, she too saw some strange lights. And though She hadn't seen them before. If she had, she would have said the lights looked different this time. When she got to the hill with Bran, there was nothing but cold silence coming from the open doorway. And both she and Bran could smell the faint metallic smell of blood. When they peered inside, it looked like there had been a slaughter. Heads were on the floor, arms severed. In fact, as they looked around at the carnage, there was not a single living creature left. Leah had no clue what could have happened. Bran secretly suspected that after they'd stolen their meat and booze, things had taken a turn for the worse. But just at that moment, they heard something approaching. Heavy footsteps, followed by a very heavy thump and a scrape. Step, step, thump, scrape, step, step, thump, scrape. Quickly, Leah and Bran hid themselves among a pile of dead bodies as an old, wretched hag walked into the fairy hill. She had matted, greasy hair hanging from all places you could grow hair, some that you couldn't. Her teeth was practically bare, her bare jaw was practically bare of teeth, apart from one, which grew down from the front of her jaw all the way to the floor. The poor, frail woman used that large tooth as a walking stick, hence the thump, scrape, and step, step. As she watched from the pile of corpses, Leah saw the old hag go over to a dead body. She grabbed an arm and started rubbing it up and down her tooth as sinews and flesh snapped away until the arm came off. The hag then took the bones to her mouth and began sucking down the marrow like some sort of jelly. She then threw the arm away and went to the next corpse. Down she went, sawing away the flesh, exposing the marrow, drinking it up, until she was standing right over where Leah was hiding. She picked up the body hiding Leah, and she could see full now as she scraped the bones away, drained them. And just as she was about to make a move to pick up Leah, a thought flashed across her eyes, and the old hag began to feel weary. Her eyes closed, she drooped forward, supported only by her overly large tooth. As she began to gently snore, Leah crept out from under the bodies. She took up her sword and with one heavy slash sliced the hag from nose to belly. If she'd expected that to kill her, she was right. What she didn't expect was for 3 fully grown men to leap out of her stomach, armed and ready for battle. Poor Bran and Leah had the fight of their lives in their hands. They slew 2 of the men, and they cut off the arm of the third, a man dressed from head to toe in red. With his arm missing, he grabbed it, legged it out the door. And Leah thought that was more than enough trouble for one night. She went back to the camp, kicked Dove and Don awake, just in time for Finn to return with the morning light. He asked them how the night's watch had gone on, and they all gave their reports. Well, said Finn, sounds like you've had a fun and profitable evening. Indeed we have, they said. And here, take these magical gifts as a present from us for even considering us as candidates to join the Fianna. Finn nodded, mumbled something about getting back in touch with them to do an internship over the summer, and promptly forgot all about them. In fact, he forgot about the whole affair. Years passed until one day, a strange man dressed from head to toe in red showed up at the camp of the Fianna. He said he was looking for a job, and Finn said he'd be happy to take him on, as long as he knew what wages the man required. Now, the man said that all he wanted was for Finn to agree to have dinner in his house after he'd served him for 7 years. Finn thought this was a bargain. He took the man on, and he proved to be one of his strongest companions. Despite the fact that the man only had one arm, he was a beast in combat. Finn was thankful that this man was on his side. But when the 7 years were done, it was time for them to go to the man's house for a final feast. They arrived there on Samhain night, which was good, because the man led them to a hill with an open doorway. Welcoming them inside of his fairy hill, he told them all to sit at the banquet table. And as they all sat down, Finn felt that something was wrong. And he was right, because the one-armed red man began to cackle madly. "Now I finally have you," he said. "You may not remember this, Finn, but your friends murdered my sweet, innocent mother. You took off my arm, and it is time for my revenge. You nor your companions shall ever break free, for the chairs you're sitting on will keep you stuck forever." And true enough, Finn and the 4 men he brought with him found themselves unable to rise from their seats. And the man began to cackle once again. "Oh, Finn, you never should have stolen from us. You never should have killed my mother, and now you will pay the price." But Finn threw his hands up. "Look, I honestly don't remember this happening, but if you say we've wronged you, we've wronged you. I will agree to pay any price you may wish us to pay, but please, for the sake of my men, let them go. You've no quarrel with them. Your quarrel is with me." The man in red shook his head. "No, Finn, they fight under your banner as your men. They will pay the price just as you. If I could get the rest of the Fianna here to slaughter them as well, I surely would." So Finn nodded again. "Okay, but before you kill us, I've always been a fan of music. As my last, final request, do you see my horn over there? Please just give me that horn so I can play a few notes on it. And once I hear the horn blowing one final time, I'll be at peace and happily die." And now he was angry at Finn, but the man in red was no man to refuse a dying man's last request. So he nodded, took up the hunting horn, and passed it to Finn, which was the biggest and last mistake the man made in his life. For that hunting horn was the Jord Finn, the calling horn of the Fianna. As soon as Finn put it to his lips, he blew out one long, clear note, heard for miles and miles around. And whenever any member of the Fianna heard that horn, they came running. The earth practically trembled around them when suddenly the red man was surrounded. The entire Fianna had shown up, and though he fought well, didn't fight well enough. The red man was slaughtered that day. Finn and his men were rescued, but they privately promised they would never ever again go inside of a fairy hill uninvited on Halloween night. Because in fairness, the fairies on Halloween are best not messed with. At the very best of times, the fairies are dangerous. They were known to blight crops, spread disease throughout your herd of cattle, strike you low with illness if you dare to cut down their trees or destroy their forts. And that's why on Halloween night, you gave them a gift. Traditionally, much like the souls of your dead ancestors, you'd leave them a bit of food, which at this time of year was either barmbrack, as I mentioned before, or caul cannon. Caul cannon is made from mashed potatoes. Oh, shock, Irish people eating potatoes. Caul cannon is mashed potatoes, onions, kale, and milk, all mixed together, served in one big communal bowl with a huge dollop of butter in the middle. It's delicious stuff. And you'd leave out a bowl for the dead and a bowl at the end of the garden with a saucer of milk for the fairies. It was basically agricultural protection money. If you didn't give the fairies a bit of food to keep them on your good side, they'd blight your crops, destroy your fences, kill your cattle. And so the best way to keep them sweet, food and milk. That, or they might start taking other things they desired. Because as I've mentioned, fairies live in another world next door to us. They can come to Earth whenever they like. But we can't do the same, or at least not properly. You see, the fairies were famous for taking people away. And once you'd been taken inside of their other world, you had to be very careful. It was said by some that if you ate or drank the food of the fairy realm, you became bound there forever. And even if you didn't, it was only on certain nights of the year, like Samhain, that you'd actually be able to break free and return to your own world. And even then, you'd need assistance. See, one Samhain night, there was a woman called Elizabeth O'Shea. Now, Elizabeth and her husband were recently married. They were in a new house together, and they were just about to drift off to sleep when she heard something coming from their kitchen downstairs. She elbowed her husband awake and told him to go and investigate. And though he grumbled and moaned, he got out of bed, went downstairs. And as soon as he was out the door, she saw something moving over by their fireplace. As it walked into the moonlight, she could see it had the body of a cat, but its face was that of a man's. As it stared at her, she felt an icy chill running down her spine. She wanted to scream, she couldn't open her mouth. She wanted to run, but she couldn't move. She was helpless as the creature kept closer and closer to the bed until it had climbed up right beside her. At that moment, she heard her husband coming back upstairs. When he entered the bedroom, he saw the cat man right next to his wife, and he roared. He ran over to the fireplace and picked up the iron poker. Now, fairies fear iron more than anything. So the cat hissed, scratched Elizabeth on the leg, and fled up the chimney. Unfortunately, the wound began to fester. By the next morning, the scratch from the cat had turned green, and by the next day, it had gone black. And that blackness spread throughout her leg, causing it to swell up to 3 times its original size. Poor Elizabeth couldn't even get out of bed anymore, much less walk. She was confined to her bed for the next year, and no matter what they tried, she seemed to be withering away. Till eventually, almost a year to the day since the cat had attacked her, well, her husband knew she didn't have long. He was beside her in the bed, gently weeping to himself, when she woke up, looked over at him, smiled. "It's okay," she said. "It's not really me." And the next day, she died and was buried. 3 years then passed. At that stage, the man had remarried, he had a new wife and a new family, but he was still living in that house. When one night, he heard a faint knocking on the back door. He got out of bed, went downstairs, and when he went to the kitchen, standing at the back doorway, he saw Elizabeth. He knew it was her, even though she looked so pale and thin. She told him that the night the cat had attacked, she had been taken. What had been left behind was a fairy copy, a changeling, and that's what they buried in the ground. She herself had been living off of table scraps. Because if you eat the food or drink the drink of the fairy realm, you're trapped there. Every night she fought her way back up to the surface, but she knew she couldn't stay there past morning. She would then go around raiding people's bins and refuse piles. And that's how she'd stayed alive. But she said she couldn't do that anymore. She'd have to give in and eat their food unless she could be rescued. Because there was a way. The next night would be Samhain night, and the fairies would be moving from their summer home to their winter home. She begged her former husband to go to the hill at midnight, armed with a black-handled iron knife. He was to wait until he saw the Sidhe approaching on their horses, and he'd spot Elizabeth on a white horse. He was to go up, cut her down from the saddle with the black-handled iron knife, and grab onto her body. The fairies would transform her shape into various different forms to convince him to let go, but it would all be an illusion. As long as he held on tightly and refused to let go until dawn, she'd come home. So that's what he did. He went there at the stroke of midnight and waited by the hill until finally the hill cracked open. He saw the fairies, tall, pale, and beautiful, riding on their horses, and amongst them Elizabeth. As soon as he spotted her, he ran up with the black-handled iron knife and cut her down. Though the fairies made to grab him, as soon as they saw the iron, they shrank away in fear. He grabbed onto his wife, but as he ran back towards his house, suddenly he was holding a wolf tearing at his throat or an eagle clawing at his eyes. So he shut his eyes and kept running, until eventually he reached his house. He could see it through the gloom, and there he could see the doorway open, waiting for him. And standing in the doorway was someone he recognized. I did mention that he'd already been remarried. The new wife took one look at him, one look at Elizabeth, shook her head. As he reached the door was slammed in his face. He fell backwards, and as he did, he let go. The last sight he ever had of Elizabeth was her tear-stained eyes as she vanished, never to be seen again. As once you eat the food of the fairy realm, you do truly become stuck there forever. And even if you can rescue someone from the fairy world on Halloween night, it's said that the joys of the fairy realm are so stunningly beautiful that regular life here on Earth becomes drab and dull in comparison. More often than not, even if you're rescued from the fairies, you'll quickly wither away and die within the year, which is why they're best avoided. As I mentioned, you're meant to dress up in a scary costume around this time of year to blend in with them, but there was an easier option. Simplest thing to do to avoid detection by the fairies and therefore avoid any dangers of them replacing you with a changeling was to just take your jacket and turn it inside out. Some say it renders you invisible to the fairies. I've always been of the opinion that the fairies are very fashionable creatures. They take one look at someone wearing their jacket inside out and will just ignore them, refusing to acknowledge they even exist. But as I've mentioned as well, sorry about the roundabout natures, it was a time to look forward to the future. You'd leave a bit of colcannon out for the fairies, a bit of colcannon out for the dead, but you didn't just eat it for yourself. When you served colcannon to your family, you put several things into the mixture. I mentioned that Baron Brack had a ring, but into the mixture of the colcannon, you tossed a ring, a coin, a rag, a stick, and a pea. Each one of them meant something different. If you found the ring, you'd get married. If you found the coin, you'd get rich. If you found the rag, you get poor. If you found the stick, you get into a fight. And if you found the pea, you would either get pregnant or get someone pregnant, genital dependent. Because most people really wanted to either get married or get the riches. You needed to have the sweet with the sour, the good with the bad, because if it was just monies all around, weddings all around, then no one would even want to play. You need that little bit of danger to make it worth playing in the first place. But as I said, most people wanted cash. Like one of Halloween's most famous figures over here, kind of, because this is going to go into a bit of folklore nerdery for a little bit. The story I'm about to do is one of my absolute favorites. It has an ancient history. I believe one of the oldest versions of the tale type is actually on Egyptian papyri, where a blacksmith faces off against death himself, trying to win eternal life. It's now known as the blacksmith and the devil, because after the Christianization of Europe, the death was replaced by the devil himself. And the man fighting against him is known by many names, but later on was called Stingy Jack. Now, Stingy Jack actually has a very interesting history when it comes to Halloween, because his story existed separate from it. But later on, after the Irish moved to America, he became associated with the jack-o'-lantern. You might have seen these turnips behind me, because at Halloween night in Ireland, before we carved pumpkins, we carved turnips. And I'll bring it a bit closer to the camera so you can see it. If you haven't seen a carved turnip before, there's also a wonderful, authentic example of one on, I believe, the National Archaeological Museum of Ireland's website. If not, just Google Irish turnip Halloween light. They're absolutely terrifying, as they're meant to be. It's originally thought that these faces may have been placed on the doorstep of your home to ward away evil, and that they represented the severed heads of your enemies. There definitely was a culture of head hunting in Ireland, and we believed that the seat of the soul was the head. So when you defeated your enemies in combat, you cut off their head, and possibly to mimic severed heads of your enemies surrounding your house, you carve root vegetables like turnips, line them up in front of the front door to ward away supernatural evil and also practical evil. Because if you go to somebody's house and there what seems to be a dozen severed heads in front of it, you're not going to mess with that person. However, later on, we decided that we used these severed heads not to mimic the heads of our enemies, but to mimic one specific man's head, Stingy Jack. Because as the story goes, where we begin, Stingy Jack was a blacksmith by trade, very talented, but this is why he was called Stingy. He was one of the greatest blacksmiths in the area, but he could never save any money. So whenever anyone asked him to spare a cent, he had nothing to give. Just something strange would happen every single time he got a bit of cash. When he was paid for a job, he'd black out and wake up the next morning surrounded by empty bottles in the company of a beautiful woman with an absolute splitting headache. It was strange how it happened so consistently. And in fact, it happened so consistently that eventually the local priest began to tell him at every single opportunity that if he wasn't careful, he'd end up damning his soul. And Jack just heard that one too many times. So eventually he decided if he was going to damn his soul, he wanted to get something out of it. He decided one Samhain night to sell his soul to the devil himself. He'd heard that if you swore an oath in the name of the devil on Samhain night, he would give you whatever you desired. And he wanted enough money to live comfortably. So one Samhain night, he said to the air, "I will gladly sell my soul to the devil, as long as he'll give me enough cash to keep me happy till the day I die." And he wasn't really sure what he expected to happen after he said those words. He certainly didn't expect Satan himself to appear before him with a contract ready to be signed. The devil then spoke in an impeccable British accent for some reason, which I will not attempt to replicate. "Jack, I will gladly take your soul. All you have to do is sign right here on the dotted line. Once you sign your soul to me, I'll give you enough gold that you could not possibly spend till the end of days. But you'll only have 7 years to spend it, Jack. For once you have spent 7 years more on this earth, you will come with me to hell." And for some reason, Jack agreed. So he sold his soul to the devil, and when he got home to his house, from the floor to the ceiling was filled with gold. He took all of his money and moved town. He didn't want his neighbors realizing what he'd done. He decided he'd build his own town since he had cash to spare. And since he was one for naming things on the nose, he named the new town Moneytown. He still worked as a blacksmith, covering his tracks as to why he always seemed to have spare money. But now that he had spare money, his life flew by in the blink of an eye, without any stress, care, or worry. Before he knew it, the 7 years were done. It had seemed like a long time when he'd made the bargain, but now, the devil was knocking at his door. In fact, the devil then burst into his house, screaming, "Jack, the time has come, and you will come with me to hell." And as soon as Jack heard the devil speak, he threw his hand up in the air and turned around from the forge. "Oh, devil," he said, "look, I made you a bargain. I'm a man of my word. I'll come with you to hell right now, except one thing. I'm absolutely parched. I didn't get a chance to grab a drink before I finished up this order because I was trying to get it done before you arrived. And I was only saying to myself last night, Jack, before the devil takes you to hell, make sure you have one final pint." And the devil was a reasonable man. He agreed that Jack could have one final drink before being taken to hell. With no drinks in the house, they decided they'd go to the local bar. And as they were approaching the barman, Jack just started patting his pockets. "Oh, devil, you're not going to believe this. I've left my wallet at home. You don't happen to have any cash on you, do you?" It's a little known fact, but the Prince of Darkness never carries petty cash. So with no way to pay for their drinks and no single chance of the devil letting Jack go back to his house, they were at their wits' end. Until suddenly Jack had a clever idea. Devil, he said, you can transform your shape. So why don't you transform into a coin? We'll use you to pay for the drinks, and then when our backs are turned, you can transform back, join me at the table, and trust me, nothing in this life tastes better than a free drink. The devil could not agree more. In that moment, he transformed into a coin, and Jack picked him up, reached inside of his pocket, took out his wallet, shoved the devil inside, slammed it closed. And yes, a tiny leather wallet would not have been able to contain Lucifer Morningstar himself, except for the fact that Jack had had 7 years to prepare for him, and so he'd lined that wallet with iron crucifixes. The power of the cross rendered the devil's magic useless. He was trapped inside the wallet, still in the form of the coin, screaming out in rage. And if you have never heard a coin scream before, let me assure you, it's a very unique sound. He opened up the wallet a little crack, and he told the devil he'd let him out, as long as he would agree to not take Jack's soul to hell for another 7 years. With no choice but to agree, the devil was let out and went back to hell. And once again, those 7 years passed so quickly. But when the devil came to claim Jack's soul for a second time, he wasn't at his forge. It took the devil hours, but eventually he found Jack wandering down a quiet forest road in the middle of nowhere. In a flash of fire, he appeared before him and said, Jack, the time has come. You will not escape me, and you will come now to your eternal torment in hell. As soon as he saw the devil, Jack shot his hands up in the air. Oh, fair enough. I'm so sorry. I must have completely lost track of the time. I'll come with you now. You must have had a nightmare finding me in the middle of nowhere like this. Oh, but there's one thing. I'm absolutely starving. I spent the whole day walking down this road, and I was saying to myself last week, Jack, before the devil takes you to hell, make sure you have a good meal. Because you wouldn't send a man to eternal damnation on an empty stomach now, would you? Of course he wouldn't. The devil wasn't an asshole, but he was wise to Jack's tricks. He wasn't going to transform his shape this time, and if he wanted food, he had to find it nearby. And so with a big smile, Jack pointed behind the devil up at a tree. Well, if you look up there, there's a beautiful red apple. Looks delicious. If you climb up that tree, pick me that apple. As soon as I'm done eating it, I'll come with you to hell. Oh, I'd climb up the tree myself. Yes, of course. It's just my sciatica is so bad today. My back's killing me. And besides, you have a lot more experience giving people apples than I do. Devil couldn't really deny that one. So he he ran up to the tree, picked the apple, and as he turned around to climb back down, he saw that Jack had surrounded the tree with iron crucifixes. Once again trapped, Jack would only let him go for another 7 years on earth. And when the devil came a third time, he was not taking prisoners. He burst into the door, screaming out in rage, Jack, the time is up. This time you're coming with me. No food, no drink, no... But he suddenly stopped. Because as was usual, as soon as Jack heard the devil, he shot his hands up and turned around. And the devil could see that Jack had been crying. Devil, he said, before you take me to hell, I just want to say, I'm so sorry. I thought you and I were having a bit of a laugh, but I now realize I've hurt you. So I want to apologize. We are about to spend the rest of all eternity together. I'd hate for us to start our relationship off on a bad foot. So to apologize, I've been making you a gift. It's right here on my anvil. Now, it's very small, so you'll have to get pretty close to see it. And the devil felt his heart melting. No one had ever bought him a gift before, and there's no way that Jack could have known. But it was the devil's birthday. So he went up to the anvil, and fair enough, Jack was right. It's very small. Couldn't even see anything at first. So he leant his face closer and closer to the anvil until his nose was actually touching against it. And he still couldn't see anything. But now he could feel it. Pressed against his nose was the smallest iron crucifix he'd felt in his life. And though he tried to pull away, it kept his nose stuck to the anvil, giving Jack plenty of time to grab his hammer. He then began wailing on the back of the devil's head for 6 hours. When he was finally done, the devil begged to be let free. And Jack said he'd let him go, as long as he would never take Jack's soul to hell. And he had to agree. But you know what they say? Careful what you wish for. For when Jack died, and died he did, he hoped heaven would let him in. See, this is where I actually have a small problem with him being called Stingy Jack. Because in his early life, yeah, he was stingy, but out of necessity. It was only later on that he became the image of charity. Realizing he couldn't take all the money he had with him to the next life, he began to spend it willy-nilly. He gave it away to those who needed it, those who wanted it, those who neither wanted it or needed it. And he hoped that would buy him a ticket to paradise. And it seemed to work. When he died, his soul left his body and floated up towards the pearly gates of heaven. He could even see St. Peter there, smiling, beckoning him forward. But then St. Peter looked at his list and began to shake his head. I'm very sorry, Jack, but I don't have you on the list. I can't possibly let you in. I think you have to go somewhere else. Because I am loose on Christian theology a lot of the time, but I'm pretty sure selling your soul to the devil is a big no-no when it comes to getting into heaven. And with no room for him in paradise, Jack was forced to travel to hell. He passed through the unending, unceasing darkness that exists between the worlds, which filled him with dread. When he finally arrived at hell's gates, he was happy to see them, anything but the unending darkness. He went up to the gates and gave a loud knock. And when the knock was heard, the gates were opened. And as the gates were opened, Beelzebub, the Lord of Flies, Lucifer, Morningstar, Satan, the devil himself was standing, who took one look at Jack, and a big smile crossed his face. "Oh no, Jack," he said. "You're not coming in here." "What do you mean?" said Jack, walking towards him. "You've been trying to take me to hell for decades. Here I am, freely offering myself up." But the devil shook his head again. "Oh, no, no. I made you a promise, Jack, and quite unlike you, I am a man of my word. Or didn't I promise you I'd never take your soul to hell?" Jack felt himself deflating like a lead balloon. "Where do I go then?" he asked. The devil just shrugged. "Not up to me, and frankly, I don't care. Just as long as you're not coming in here. I suggest you go back to the darkness, Jack." "No," said Jack, "anything but that. You can't send me back out there." And the devil seemed to relent a bit. "Fair enough, Jack. I won't let you in here, but tell you what. As a parting gift, take this to light your way." And as he spoke, he plucked an ember from hell deep down low. He grabbed Jack by the nose, and before Jack realized what was happening, that fiery ember had been shoved right up his left nostril. As the gates of hell slammed shut on him forever, his whole head burst aflame. And even as the flames died down, fire continued to spill from his eyes, mouth, and the two slits that were once his nose. He turned his flaming head to the dark and started walking. And he's been walking ever since. Unwelcome in heaven, unwelcome in hell. Jack travelled between worlds. Occasionally, you'd see his flaming head bobbing along in the darkness, tempting travellers to follow it in the night. Best not. Jack travels on unsafe roads, so if you follow him, you'll end up neck deep in a bog hole, lost to the world forever. But Stingy Jack was a man who tricked the devil, not once, not twice, 3 times. And wicked spirits gave him his due. If they saw Stingy Jack, they walked the other way. And so you mimicked his face by carving his likeness into a turnip. You then stick a candle inside of its hollowed out carcass and leave it on your doorstep. People would then think that Stingy Jack was visiting your house, and so wicked spirits would leave it well enough alone. And in fact, the habit of carving jack-o'-lanterns, named for Stingy Jack, continues on every Halloween to this day. Nowadays, replaced by the ever ubiquitous pumpkin, but to be perfectly honest, I carved that one yesterday. Carving pumpkins is a hell of a lot easier than carving turnips, and I completely understand why they were replaced. And for a bit of nerding out once again, the Pumpkin Association seems to have actually been triggered in and around the 18th century over in America, because influenced by Sleepy Hollow. So obviously, end of Sleepy Hollow, Ichabod Crane gets the pumpkin thrown at him by the Headless Horseman, which is also very much so influenced by an Irish folkloric creature called the Dullahan, which was Headless Horseman who would ride around the country, either atop his own horse or on the Coche de Bourg, the death coach, which would travel along, led by headless horses, whipped by a human spine, with human skins serving as the covering for the carriage. And wherever the Coche de Bourg or the Dullahan stopped, death would follow. But the Headless Horseman chucks the pumpkin at Ichabod Crane, and later artistic depictions showed the pumpkin being his head. That then seemed to have been conflated with Stingy Jack, and we have a reference from around the 19th century of a great Halloween party where there were many, many, many pumpkins carved human-like faces, possibly the first reference we have of them being used and then connected with Stingy Jack, till the more modern times when Stingy Jack is pretty much one of the main emblems of Halloween, despite the fact that with a name like Jack, you're going to be pretty sure he didn't actually originate in Ireland. He seems to be this strange cocktail of influences from Great Britain, America, and Ireland, all mixed together in this beautiful modern creation, which is why I think in many ways he stands up as the best emblem we possibly have for modern Halloween. Less so traditional Samhain, because I am aware I have talked for quite a long time now, quite rambling, I do apologize. I'm going to finish off with one final story, and then I believe you wanted a bit of Q&A afterwards. If there's any questions, start thinking of them now. Because to finish off on my predicting the future rants that I've gone on, it does seem to have been something that did play upon people's minds. Particularly at this time of year, you wanted to know what the future had in store. You played your various divinatory games, and in fact, some said that the puka, after waylaying drunkards all the previous night and befouling the blackberries throughout the land, would go to various hills throughout Ireland and be peaceful for one and only day, 1st of November. The day after Halloween, you could approach him safely and he'd give you predictions as to what the future had in store for you. Because we always want to know these things that we can't seem to actually know. Like this one. There was a young man who had a mother and father, strangely, like many of us do, and his father was practically a saint. No one in the town had a bad word for him, whereas his mother, awful. No one had a kind word to say about her. She was a miserly, meddling woman who no one would have batted an eyelid had she died the next day. Unfortunately for them, the husband was the first one to go. There was great lamentation in the town. And even the sky itself seemed to cry for him. Because when it came time for his funeral and for him to be put in the ground, the biggest torrential downpour that Ireland had known in 10 years hit them. It was only from the sheer love and devotion they had to that man that they managed to bury him in the first place. And about 2 weeks later, his wife did pass on. And it was the strangest thing. When it came time to bury her, the most beautiful, stone-splitting sunshine Ireland had ever known pierced the sky. And no one could understand it. Well, the man who everyone loved had had horrible weather, whereas the woman that no one had a kind word to say about had the most beautiful weather they'd ever known. Now, eventually the town stopped talking about it, but their son couldn't let it go. He just couldn't understand why his father, who everyone loved, had bad weather, and his mother, who everyone hated, had good weather. So he decided he would not rest in the same place for 2 nights in a row until he learnt the truth. He set off and was traveling for the full day, until eventually he came upon an old widow's house with 3 daughters. She welcomed him in, sat him down, gave him food, and asked him the purpose of his journey. He explained why he'd set off to learn about his mother and father's fate. And she said, well, while you're finding that out, could you find out something for me? See, I've got these 3 daughters here. And the 3 of them, all gorgeous, not a single problem with them. But my 2 youngest are up to their ears in marriage proposals. Not a single one of the men in the town wants to marry my eldest daughter, and I don't know why. Could you find out for me? Okay, said the young man. I have my own troubles to be dealing with, but thanks to your hospitality, I'll find out the answer to your question if I happen to get the chance. So the next day he set off and was traveling on for the full day, until he came upon a blacksmith's forge. The blacksmith welcomed him in, sat him down, gave him a bit of food. And after they'd eaten their meal, the blacksmith asked him the purpose of his journey. After explaining he wanted to find out about his mother and father and why the widow's eldest daughter had no marriage proposals, the blacksmith said, while you're doing that, could you find out something for me? You see, I'm working in my forge from sunrise on Monday morning until sunset on Sunday night. And yet I can't seem to save a single penny. No matter how hard I work, I get no more money, and I just can't understand why. Could you find out for me? Jesus, says the boy. Okay, fair enough. If I happen to get the chance to find out the answer to your question, as well as my own and the widow's, I'll do so. Next day, he sets off and is traveling for the full day, until he arrives at a farmer's house. The farmer welcomes him in, sips him down, gives him a bit of food, and when they're done their meal, he asks the boy the purpose of his journey. After hearing that he wanted to find out about his mother and father, about the widow's eldest daughter, and about the blacksmith unable to save cash, the farmer looks thoughtful for a moment and then says, while you're at that, could you find out something for me? If you look at the back of my house there, there's a leak coming down from the ceiling. No matter what I do, I cannot plug that leak, and I don't understand why. Could you find out for me? Jesus Christ, said the boy. Right. With all these other questions I'm having to answer, I won't even get an answer to my own question now, but for your hospitality, I'll do what I can. And the next day he was traveling on a long time, much longer than before. In fact, it was well past dark when he finally found a rather magnificent house. He went up to the house to find the door open. And when he walked in, he saw a well put together kitchen. He could smell food in the stove and saw a pot of boiling water. And at that moment, a handsome woman walked in. He couldn't quite tell her age. She was not young, but she was not old. She smiled at him a warm smile and asked if he'd like to stay the night. So she sat him down, they shared a meal together, passing a nice and pleasant conversation, until eventually she said it was time for them to head to bed. She told him to sleep in the guest bed right opposite the kitchen, where she retreated upstairs. He went down to the guest bed, lay down, tried to close his eyes and go to sleep, but he couldn't. His mind was still turning like a hamster on a wheel. He couldn't turn it off. And as he lay there unable to sleep, he stared out into the kitchen opposite him. And he saw that the boiling water from earlier was still on the fire. It was now beginning to boil over, and he half felt that, being her guest, he should get up and lift it off the fire to make sure it didn't spill out. But then he heard a creaking coming down the staircase. Something told him to stay quiet as he saw the woman come down from the bedroom and walk over to the boiling pot. He was half about to ask if she wanted a hand lifting the pot off of the flames when he saw her grip the edge of the pot with her bare hands and slowly lower her head into the boiling water, followed by her arms, torso, and finally her feet disappeared in. He was too shocked to move, till eventually, when he was absolutely convinced she must have been boiled away to nothing, he saw her feet again. Just as she'd gone in, she came out, feet followed by legs, followed by torso, followed by head, not looking even slightly worse for wear. As he watched her, she then went over and picked up a chair. She took the chair to under one of the rafters, took a rope, and swung the rope over. She formed a noose in the rope, stuck her head through, and kicked the chair away. She then dangled from the ceiling for long enough for him to be convinced she was definitely dead this time. And yet, just as before, she came back to life. She took a straight razor from her pocket, cut herself down, and without even pausing to blink, she drew the razor straight across her throat. She collapsed to the floor, blood oozing underneath her, crashing until finally her legs stopped moving. He was utterly convinced she was gone this time, but yet again, she rose back to her feet, wiped the blood away, and went to a cupboard. She then picked out a bag of what seemed to be money. She then spent just as much time as she'd spent hanging or boiling, counting those coins, ranging them in piles, until she seemed satisfied. She then took a book, sat down on her chair, and began reading for the exact same length of time until she closed it and looked straight at him. "Are you awake?" she asked, and he wisely said nothing. "I know you're awake," she said. "You saw?" "Yes," he said. "Tell me," she said, "have you ever heard of the Queen of Planets?" He said he had. "You came here with questions," she said, "and I have answers for you. For as long as I spent boiling in the pot, anyone that is born into this world during that time, that is how they will die. For as long as I spent swinging from the rafters on the ceiling, any child that is born into this world during that time, that is how they will die. Any child that is born into the world while I lay on the floor bleeding, that is how they will die. And any child that is born into this world while I was counting the coins, that is how they will live, by counting the money of others. And any child that is born into this world while I was reading, that is how they will live, through scholarship and learning. You should tell the widow that her oldest daughter is not considered kind. Get her to carry her mother on her back to Mass next Sunday, and she'll have a marriage proposal within the week. The blacksmith should know that toiling from sunrise on Monday till sunset on Sunday night is no way to live. If he works less, he'll benefit from it, and cash will come. And you should tell the farmer that he stole the original thatch for his roof, and until he has replaced every last straw with a straw that he himself owns, he will never be free of that leak. As for your father and mother, Well, your father was beloved. So that one day of horrible rain and storm was the one day he spent in purgatory. He is now enjoying paradise in heaven. And your mother, well, that one day of sun is the last day of joy she will ever know, for she is now tormented in hell. To avoid you bringing home news of her misfortune, she will try to stop you as you near your home. She will appear before you chased by 2 dogs, her mouth agape to swallow you alive. What you must do is take an apple and throw it in her mouth. Then you will be spared. He fell asleep in her house that night and awoke the next day, alone in the middle of the road. He began the long journey home. He stopped at the farmer, told him to replace the thatch. He stopped at the blacksmith and told him to work a bit less. And he stopped at the widow and told her to get her daughter to carry her to mass that Sunday. And as he neared his own home, he did indeed see his mother, her mouth agape, stretching from her nose to her shins. He took the apple he had in hand, threw it at her, and she and the 2 dogs vanished. So I'm not sure if there's a moral or a lesson in that story, but all I know is it's the end of that one, which does mean thank you so much for having me for a long, rambling hour and a half. It's been an absolute pleasure. If there's any questions at all, please let me know.
I think, well, we're at 5 o'clock. I would like to actually say to the students that this is more typical of the way Irish stories end. Irish stories, in fact, have this non-ending ending. They don't wrap up neatly. They don't do, big morals. They kind of just seem to just fizzle or just continue in a way that leaves you wondering, wait, what next?
Time with the Fenian stories, it's because I think it's a beautiful phrase from the Fenian saga itself of it's the music of what happens. So each individual story doesn't actually end. It's just one episode in the story that is from their birth to their death. And even then it doesn't end there. Whereas the folktales, you're dead right, I've found some egregious examples over the years of just what seems to be, we loved starting the story, we loved developing it in the middle, now we are bored, we want it to be over, everyone dies.
Yeah, that's kind of about it. The mystical elements, the time element, the lack of time to it are also other ones. Just one question for you, and then we'll let everybody go. And that is, what do you think the moral of Jack's story is? Because it's kind of a strange one. Like, he gets away with things. He's kind of punished, but is he really punished? And, because we have the jack-o'-lantern, and, we have all this that we continue on that people don't realize, but it's a ambiguous one, or it's a lot of gray, which also I think is kind of typical of a lot of Irish stories too.
Yes, very much so. I think part of the problem is that the moral, if there was a moral lesson in the story originally, I think it's been long lost. And they've tried to tack on different morals as time has gone by. I think it makes a little bit more sense when you think, oh, originally the devil was actually death. So without the negative connotations on the devil himself, Jack's primary crime was sinning against the natural order of things. And if anything, the moral of the story, I think, was about accepting the natural life cycle. Yes, it's horrible that we will all eventually die, but at the end of the day, perhaps having a final rest is its own reward and its own comfort, because who wants to end up like we'll say Jack, because the name that it would have been is long lost, but do you want to end up like them, wandering on this earth for all eternity, everything you know and love passing you by, disappearing? Or do you want to have that final rest and that final sleep? That's why I think the image of him is always walking is an important one. He was also created to explain, I'm trying to remember the Latin term now to be fancy, but I'll give up on such pretensions. Gas lights in the middle of the bog or various marshes, any sort of wetland. So again, he's this weird mixture of trying to explain a natural phenomenon, trying to do a parable about the rightness of death, and trying to tack on why do we carve root vegetables at Samhain night. He's this weird amalgamation, which is why I think the moral is long lost with this story.
Yeah. Well, and that bit of Christianity, because we always have to throw in a bit of Christianity. Yeah, which I think you're right, confuses it. If you think of it as cheating death, that's a totally different take on the story.
I think it does work a little bit better that way. But again, as with many Irish stories, don't necessarily need a moral. If at the end of the day, you tell a story either to make people laugh or cry, and if you can accomplish either, you're golden.
Well, with that, thank you so much for joining us. And yes, and here is hopefully to next year, and to be live in person in Ireland again, with no unpleasant surprises, hopefully. Yeah. Hopefully. Yes. Alrighty. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye. Take care now.